Hey everyone, welcome to Encounters USA. If it's aliens, UFOs, Bigfoot, or Dogmen you're looking for, you came to the right place. Now listen up as we listen to some of the latest encounters. Hello everyone, and welcome to Encounters USA. I'm your host, author Matthew Hines. If you're new to Encounters USA, we cover alien, Bigfoot, and Dogman encounters. So if this kind of thing is your bag, baby, go ahead and hit that subscribe button on YouTube and subscribe on the iTunes podcast. All right, you guys, we have a really exciting show today. We have a treat for not only you UFO buffs, but for all of you conspiracy people as well, as we look into the famous or infamous Maury Island UFO incident. Now, why is the Maury Island incident so important? Well, first of all, because it actually preceded, if the dates are right, it preceded Roswell by a week, and it preceded the Kenneth Arnold sightings by 3 days. So we're going to look into that a little bit more. But this sighting at Maury Island near Tacoma, Washington, is one of the most important and one of the most bizarre and interesting UFO sightings that have ever happened, and especially in the history of the United States. Even without the UFO involvement, the cast of characters and the things that happened afterwards really affected American history, but we're going to talk about more about that later. All right, so yes, it is important, and yes, it appears to be the first UFO encounter and definitely preceding Roswell by at least 2 weeks. So we're also going to look into some of the characters that are going to end up actually being accused of. One of them is going to be accused of being the shooter on the grassy knoll in the JFK assassination. So I assure you, it's going to get very, very bizarre from here on out. All right, so before I go too much farther, this is a very complicated subject, and there's a lot of people that have input in it. A lot of people have researched it, and so I would just want you to understand where I'm getting my information from. And the person who I first heard about this was the paranormal researcher or parapolitical researcher, as they say on one of the podcasts I listen to, is Ken Thomas. So I get a lot of my information from a lecture that he did. And also, as far as the encounter and what happened with the Air Force plane, I got a lot of my information from that, from the UFO Hunters on the History Channel. Now, going back to Ken Thomas, he's done a lot of work on this stuff, and I would like to actually at some point get Ken onto Encounters USA to talk about this encounter, but also his other books that are NASA, Nazis, and UFOs. He's got a book called The Octopus about the Energy Banking Consortium. And he's also got another book, of course, about this particular encounter at Maury Island near Tacoma. So, pretty interesting, huh? Now, I know you probably are asking yourself, which is a logical question, is that if there's been so much done on this topic, why would I need to do another, jump into it even more? Well, the fact of the matter is that, first of all, it is very important, as I said, incident that happened. It's very important for UFO research. It's important for people who are concerned about a secret government. But the main reason that I'm coming back into this is because the more I listen to the researchers and I see people talking about this, I have to say, wait a minute, you're not asking the right questions, and you're not looking at the right things, and you're not really, and I don't want to take away from these guys that are doing this great research, because I certainly wouldn't know anything about this if they hadn't done it. But there are a lot of things about this incident that people don't even ask a question about. So as we go into this in more detail, I know that there's going to be people out there that, number one, know nothing about this, and so this is all going to be news to them. So these are the people that I'm really gearing this podcast toward. If you are a Maury Island expert or author or whatever, I would sure like to get you onto the podcast to talk about the research that you've done. And I would sure like to hear anybody's input in the comments section if you would just leave that on the YouTube video. But in between, there's going to be people who maybe know a little bit about the Maury Island incident, and maybe know they've seen JFK, and so they're going to kind of have a little bit of background on what I'm talking about. So I'm coming at kind of an advantage of people who would have seen JFK, the movie, and I guess we're getting so far along in time that we might be hard pressed with the younger crowd to, maybe a lot of them haven't seen that movie yet, but I'm just gambling that a lot of people who listen to this podcast will understand some of the characters and remember some of the characters from the JFK movie, and the people that Jim Garrison, the New Orleans district attorney, brought in for prosecution to tie them with the Kennedy murder. All right, so that's why we're going back into this, because I want to, first of all, tell you what happened, and that's what we're going to do on this podcast. But not only that, I want to explain the characters, and then we're going to actually go to Maury Island and check it out, and do some investigation there and talk about some of the stuff that happened there and in Tacoma at the hotel where these people met. So that'll be in a later podcast. But for right now, this, just excuse me, just to sum up the importance of this, because the encounter involves not one, but it actually involves two encounters on Maury Island. It involves a crashed and possibly sabotaged Air Force airplane, a B-25 bomber. It involves the Men in Black and a threat to keep silent. It involves alleged material that was ejected from a UFO off Maury Island. So there is no way we can just do this all in one podcast. If we were to try to do that, I would probably have to send out aspirin to everybody who listened to the podcast, because they'd be sitting there scratching their head going, now who did what, when, how, where? No, you can't really treat this like that, because there's just too much information, and there are, there's too many people moving in and out of the picture, and then the picture shifting through time into other scenarios. So without going too far into that, I don't know how many podcasts this is actually going to take. I think that we will do this podcast today, and we're going to discuss, we're going to give a background of the post-World War II era that we're going to be talking about. We're going to be giving a background on the characters today, and we're going to be giving a play-by-play, a chronological list of events that happened at Maury Island and in Tacoma. Now, I don't think that when we go into all of that stuff, I like to keep these podcasts close to an hour. So I think that is going to be just about all the time that we're going to have in this hour, just to get you familiar with the characters, to get you familiar with the lay of the land, and to get you familiar with the situation, the things that are going on, and because all of these things are going to be important for you to understand when we actually take a trip to Tacoma and we start looking at the hotel where these meetings took place, and we go out to Maury Island and we take the boat out and have a little jaunt out to see exactly where the slag fell out of the UFO, if it supposedly did. So there's a lot of information that's going to be ahead of us, and I'm going to try to make it as easy to remember and as easy to understand as possible. And if I don't do that, then just go ahead and leave a comment in the description and ask me what you didn't understand or what you need to have cleared up. And now also remember that I'm not researching anything. I'm other than listening to what other people have done and giving that information to you. I'm not researching anything. And by the third podcast, we're going to go over every item that we're talking about here. And I'm going to have a lot of questions. So I might try to get answers to some of them. And maybe some of you have answers to those questions. But there are a lot of questions that have not been asked about this whole incident. And so with that as our background, or with that as our preface, now let's start talking about the background to the Maury Island incident. Now, the first thing that you have to understand is this happened in the year 1947, and the date is June 21st. So I want you to think about that. It's in Tacoma, Washington. Apparently, it's a day with a lot of visibility. We're on Puget Sound, and I'm going to have pictures and all of this when we actually go out to Maury Island. I'm going to actually let you see the area and everything that this place that all these things happened in. But I just want you to get a picture and the feel for it's summer, kids are out of school, people are out. And in Washington State, where you don't get a lot of sunny weather, people are out happy, taking advantage. And then suddenly, these guys are out collecting logs, and something crazy happens. But just so that you understand how crazy this thing that happened was, remember it's 1947. 2 years ago, not even 2 years before, World War II had ended. The war in Japan didn't end until August of 45. So it's been 2 years of people coming back to the United States, transitioning back, trying to get jobs, trying to get their lives back together. And one of the people that gets involved into this is a guy named Fred Chrisman, who fits into this returning vet category quite well. But we'll be talking about Fred and all these other characters later. But I just want you to understand that this is it's the 40s. It's not even the 50s yet. And nobody knows anything about something that would be called a UFO or a flying saucer. Nobody's heard about it. Now, that is not to say that there have not been a lot of not only encounters, but there's been a lot of publicity. From the war in Europe, there were these people talking about the fighter pilots were talking about Foo Fighters. They were talking about Foo Fighters in Japan. They were these craft that they thought it was the other side thought it was us, but there was a lot of this activity in the air. After the war, there were mass sightings of UFOs all over the place. Was it because of the detonation of the atom bomb? Who knows? I'm not an alien. I don't know. But it seemed that there was a huge spike in the reports of these UFOs. Now, one thing that comes into play that you have to understand when you talk about the Maury Island incident is these things called fugo balloons, which were launched by the Japanese as a desperate attempt towards the end of the war to set the forests to the Pacific Northwest and Northern California on fire and hopefully choke all the people back east with that soot and smoke. But it didn't really happen. And a couple of people, I think one person or two people actually were killed because they didn't know what they were. And when they went to touch them, the things exploded. But in this explanation, that for the UFOs that we're talking about to be these fugo balloons, they would have had to been up in the atmosphere for 2 years. And that means that because of the jet stream, they would have had to, they don't just stay in one place at any time. They would have had to go around the Earth and around the Earth. And I don't know if it would have been possible for them to keep whatever gas was keeping them up there. I don't know if that would have lasted that long. So that's, anyway, that when you get into this story, that's one thing that you are going to hear about. All right. So the last thing that I want to talk about is that the Air Force was for a long time was part of the Army. And so just recently, they were always the Army Air Force. And so just recently, have they become their own entity? They become the United States Air Force, not the United States Army Air Force. And so that was a fairly recent development. And so you have an organization. I mean, they have like more airplanes than anybody in the world. It's like a company that has all this stuff, but no place to put it. So the Air Force was playing catch up, and it was a crazy new world. You know, it was now about air power and rockets and space, and you know who knew what was going on. And so the bottom line is, it was a time in America and around the world where a lot of things were really unsure. In America, more sure than most, but there was a lot of unsurety. And there was a lot of, with the technology, there was a lot of, people looking at the sky and wondering, loving science fiction and being fascinated by the idea of life in outer space and men on Mars. And so it really captured people's imagination. And I don't think it hurt anything that there were so many UFO sightings at the time. And along with these came a number of clubs and organizations to follow them and monitor them. And by the 50s, you're going to have a whole ton of organizations that are interested in UFOs and ufology. And that is going to continue. And actually, balloon mushroom, like a mushroom cloud to today, where even author Matthew Hines, is doing a podcast about UFO encounters, along with paranormal things like Bigfoot and Dogman, because somebody has to. I mean, somebody has to put this information out, and I'm pretty sure the government is never going to come out and actually tell you that there's any of these things actually exist. And just pay attention to my channel, and you'll certainly find out why. All right. So we understand it's the end of World War II, and everybody's happy, coming back and getting jobs. And we have a guy that is, his background, I don't have a lot of information on, but we do know that he is partners with another guy who we get a lot of information on. But we're talking about a guy who owns a boat, and his name is Harold Dahl. Now, Harold Dahl owns the boat, according to the researchers, and he is out. His job is going out and picking up stray logs that, if you don't know how logging is done out in the Pacific Northwest, you collect a lot of logs, and since there's no place to put them, like, I come from near Port Angeles where this happened, but they have log like out in the water, like in Puget Sound, they have these booms. And so they have hundreds, thousands of logs, sometimes like square miles full of logs that are heading for the mill or heading for overseas, whatever. So they just put them out into these log booms, log rafts, and they tie them together. Now, sometimes these things break and those logs drift off and they have to be pulled back. So apparently, a man named Harold Dahl had a boat, a World War II surplus, I guess kind of a scow, and his son, they owned a boat, and they had a partner named, their name was Dahl. The father's name was Harold, and I don't know the son's name. And they had a partner named Fred Chrisman. Now, on the day in question, and this was on June 21st, and I just want you to make sure you understand this. It's June 21st. It's the longest day of the year, right? It's the summer solstice. Kenneth Arnold would not have a sighting, according to the reports, until June 24th. He would not have his sighting until 3 days later. So what he was doing here is a big question I have, but that goes into episode 3, and it's just one of the many questions that I have. But Maury Island happened on June 21st. Kenneth Arnold sees UFOs above Rainier, just a few miles or 100 miles away, not even. And 3 days later, and Roswell happens about a week after that, maybe 2 weeks after that. So there, and I just have to mention now, since we talked about the Fugo balloons, there are people that think that the Maury Island UFOs, which we'll get into the sighting in a second here, the Maury Island UFOs and the Kenneth Arnold sighting and the Roswell, they're all the same ships. Now, there's a couple things that we need to talk about here. And first of all, we need to really figure out what the date is. But when people talk about the Roswell crash, which they're not, I mean, in Roswell, despite what you see on TV, this thing happened, and then a while later, this rancher found it. Now, if you pay attention to it's so hard to keep, up with the conspiracy stories, whatever, but there was not one crash at Roswell. There were actually 2 crashes. And so people that are investigating this, that are saying, well, the one that crashed at Roswell, that was also related. Well, there wasn't one that crashed at Roswell. There were 2 that crashed at Roswell. And a lot of people really seem to either not know that or they seem to have forgotten that. So 2 aircraft crashed at Roswell. Now, before that ever happened, we're back in Tacoma, Washington. And there is a guy with his son, and it's Harold Dahl, and he's out getting logs near Maury Island, near Tacoma, Washington. It is a sunny day, and suddenly 6, as he described them, donut-shaped saucers flew over, and I assume the donut means that they were hollow in the center. I've never got that. So another question. But 6 donuts fly over. One of them seems to be in trouble, and it starts to eject material. Now, the material ejects from the saucer and drops down onto Harold Dahl's boat. And according to the story, it hit his son in the arm and I think burned his arm or broke his arm. And then it also hit his dog and killed it. So following this incident, the next thing that we know is that Harold Dahl, there's no info. I haven't heard anything. Did they rush into shore? Did the kid go to the hospital? Where is the medical record of this happening? The dog was killed. So, where is the record of all this? So anyway, We don't know anything else that happened after that. What we do know is the next day is that Dahl returns, and he is with Fred Chrisman. Now, we're going to have to assume that Fred Chrisman came out with Dahl on the boat. And I because of what happened afterward, but I assume that he went out with Chrisman with Dahl, and Chrisman went out on the boat because Fred Chrisman, I guess, according to the story, thought that, oh, these guys are drinking again, and he had to see for himself. Now, if the son had a broken arm and the dog was dead, why would he accuse them of drinking again? All right, or drinking. So they go out, and and Fred Chrisman gets to see the site, and then, according to the story, a UFO returns, and Fred Chrisman sees the UFO and runs away. Now, when we go down to Tacoma and actually look at these locations, we're going to take you to the place where Fred ran away, and so you have a better idea of exactly what he was looking at, and we'll go out on our paddle ski and we'll get an idea of where their boat was when it got hit. So that'll be exciting stuff, but Fred Chrisman goes running for his life. Now, again, it's very difficult to tell this story because you have to keep jumping back and forth. So I'm just going to give you a teaser that we're going to come back and talk about Fred Chrisman a little bit more. But right now, or a lot more actually, but right now we have to continue on with what happened. So Chrisman runs away, and apparently he's a believer. And so they contact, according to the story now, they contact Kenneth Arnold. Now, Kenneth Arnold, I don't know why they contacted him. Kenneth Arnold lives in Idaho. He lives in Boise. And he is contacted. Oh, no, he's not contacted. Fred Chrisman has been in contact with a guy named Ray Palmer. And Ray Palmer is a publisher of a bunch of magazines, and one of which is called Fate, and another was Amazing Stories. So Raymond Palmer, this publisher, he contacts Kenneth Arnold and says, hey, Kenneth Arnold, and why and how he knows Kenneth Arnold, he says, would you go and check this out? Now, Kenneth Arnold goes and checks out the material. He listens to the story. But even before we tell that story, we have to look at what happened when Kenneth Arnold drove from or flew from Idaho up to Tacoma. He gets there, and he finds all the hotels are booked. And so according to the story now, as desperation, he goes to the fanciest hotel and goes to check in, and they say, "Oh, we have a room for you, reserved already." So that's kind of surprising. Another thing that happens after this encounter, whatever, is that very soon after the encounter, Mr. Harold Dahl gets a visit from a person he describes as wearing all black sunglasses, driving a black car. And he tells Kenneth or Harold Dahl, do not talk to anybody about this encounter you've had, or bad things are going to happen. The standard Men in Black encounter. So this is your first UFO sighting. This is your first UFO material gathering. And this is your first UFO Men in Black, encounter. So pretty interesting stuff. So in this room where Mr. Kenneth Arnold and Harold Dahl and Fred Chrisman are meeting, Kenneth Arnold decides there's enough to this that he contacts a couple of Air Force officers named, I believe it was Davidson, Captain Davidson, and a Lieutenant Brown. And so they all go to this hotel room in Tacoma. And as I said, when we go down to Tacoma, we'll go down and we'll visit the hotel itself. So you don't want to miss that. So these guys all meet, and the Air Force officers, they look at this, what is basically, they describe it as one part of this material is black. And then the other part of the material is white. And from what I understand, I believe that when the white material hit the water, it started boiling and steaming. So I think we're to assume that the white material was like white, kind of hot, whatever, right? So something to think about. But anyway, as we continue on, we got these men meeting in this hotel room in Tacoma. And Davidson and Brown say, okay, this is enough. We believe your story. We're going to take this stuff back, and we're going to take it back to, I believe that they were going to take it back to California. Now, who were Davidson and Brown? Right now, we're just going to talk about, they were kind of like in counterintelligence, right? Now, before we go any farther, we have to go back and we have to talk about, there was another, I believe he was a general brought in, and his name's unimportant because it's just another name and it's going to confuse you. But this person called the FBI. Actually, it was either him or Fred Chrisman called the FBI. So we have all of this list of characters. We have, just so that we don't get lost here, we have Harold Dahl, boat owner, injured son. We have Fred Chrisman, who is a co-boat owner and went out the following day, who was apparently scared away by the UFO. We have first UFO sighting ever, Mr. Kenneth Arnold. We have a Captain Davidson and Brown. Now we're going to add two other people. The first one we're going to add is Guy Bannister. Guy Bannister happens to be the special agent in charge for the Montana-Idaho region. Now, I apologize, I'm not sure who called in Guy Bannister. I believe that it was Fred Chrisman because of what happened following these events. But for right now, Guy Bannister, whose background in UFOs is quite bizarre, because you remember we were talking about the balloons, right? The pogo balloons, whatever, fugu from Japan. Well, Guy Bannister was given a 30-inch disc, which some lady said that had crashed or whatever, and which she had claimed was a UFO, and which he had dismissed as one of these fogo balloons. So Guy Bannister already has some kind of, contact with UFO material, and this is before Roswell, all right? So Guy Bannister is now involved. And finally, there's one more person we're going to throw into the mix here, and this is a reporter, and his name is Ted Murillo. Now, Ted Murillo is a reporter for, I think, UPI, and he calls Harold Dahl or he calls Kenneth Arnold in his room and basically repeats verbatim the entire conversation that they have had. So it is obvious that this room has been bugged. And so this reporter, Morello, he starts asking Arnold questions. And so everybody's freaking out about what's going on. Now, is that the end of the story? No, that's not even the beginning of the story. Now, the two Air Force pilots they or Air Force officers, one of them obviously a pilot. I guess they'd have to be pilot and co-pilot. So they take this stuff. They're giving it to them, I guess, according to the story, however apocryphal it might be, given the material in a cornflakes box. And they take the stuff and they put it on their airplane and they take off. And they take off from Lewis McChord, which is down a little ways past Tacoma. And not too much later, in fact, just a few minutes after they take off, their airplane, according to the report, catches fire, the wing catches fire, and the airplane crashes. It kills the pilots, and the two people who were on board managed to bail out. When the Air Force went out to search the wreckage, none of this material from the UFO was ever supposedly recovered. In fact, the plane was so badly burned, not much at all was recovered. So there's a number of questions about these Air Force officers and this plane and about why and how it crashed that we still need to look at. But again, guys, that's going to be podcast 3. All right, so let's see if we have we've covered all of the chronological events of things that happened after the people left the hotel room. The officers got on their plane and crashed. Now, there's a couple of things that we haven't talked about yet and that I think we have time to talk about, but I just want to close this particular part about the timeline of events at the hotel and these Air Force guys. Remember I said that Harold Dahl got a visit from the Men in Black? Well, this man in black told him that if he didn't, stop talking to people about the UFO, then he was going to have a lot of trouble. And I don't know exactly what he said, but according to the story, this man in black told him he'd have a lot of trouble. And, Mr. Dahl, being from Washington State, he basically told him where he could put his threats and ignored him completely and called in Kenneth Arnold or called in the people that they called in. And subsequently, Arnold's business of gathering logs out in Puget Sound, it basically went belly up. His wife got horribly, horribly sick, and his son disappeared for months. And then finally they found him out in Montana bussing tables, and he had no idea how he got there. So all of these strange things happened coming out of this Maury Island UFO encounter. So as I said, I like to do these shows for about an hour, but I think we have a little bit of time, and I really want to start talking about this Fred Crispin character because this person was named by Jim Garrison in the movie JFK. I'm not the New Orleans district attorney, but he was named as the shooter on the grassy knoll. So before we go, I want to give you a little bit of background on Fred Crispin and how he actually got involved in this Maury Island incident. And I apologize if I didn't come out earlier and talk about this, but as I said, the characters, the events, they are almost confusing, and they have to be done in just the right way, or it's very hard to keep, Kenneth Arnold and Arnold Palmer and Palmer, Raymond Palmer, and, it just goes on and on. So then just trying to keep this as easy to understand as possible. I left the background on Fred Crispin out, but Fred Crispin is a pilot himself. And we're going to talk about this when we get to when we get to podcast 3, when we start asking and maybe even answering some of our questions. But Fred Chrisman is a pilot. Now, he got introduced to Raymond Palmer, who is the publisher of these magazines, because of a story that had turned up in one of Palmer's magazines, and somebody had written an op-ed and said, "Oh, this is all these people are crazy, this UFO stuff," and Fred Chrisman wrote in and said no, because let me give you a background on what was so crazy. There was a guy named Shaver, and he claimed he was a welder, and that he claimed that through his welding equipment, he got messages from these people called, I believe it's called Davos. And these were people that apparently looked like ETs, but they didn't fly around in ships. They came from underground. So during the war, during World War II, remember I said these guys were coming back from the war. Well, during World War II, Fred Chrisman was reportedly a flyer, and he reportedly said that he was attacked in a cave in Burma, and they were flying what was called the hump to Chinese troops over the Himalayas. So he may have been in Burma, maybe supplying the Maya Tanaka Trail. I can never say that right. But according to Fred Chrisman, when this guy wrote in and said, "Oh, it's a bunch of hooey," whoever believed of space or creatures talking through people's welding equipment, and apparently, according to the story, Fred Chrisman said, "No, it's true," and I, ran into these things in Burma, and they shot me in the arm with a laser. Now, this is before a laser had ever been invented, and I'm not going to be able to talk about this later, but one of the people who Fred Chrisman comes in contact with later on, his son is a genius, and he, as a kid, makes his own argon laser. So how does, who knows what kind of influence Fred Chrisman had on him, if any. So that is the background on Fred Chrisman. And then when this guy had told his story, and Fred Chrisman said, "No, I was attacked by these Davos people." Well, then all kinds of people started writing in saying, "Yes, that happened to me as well." So it just led to this chain of events, and so this Chrisman, who had written his letter to Raymond Palmer, publisher of these Amazing Stories papers magazine, which later became Steven Spielberg's Amazing Stories. I don't know exactly what stories or any if were actually used in Spielberg's miniseries, but during the, I believe, 90s, Spielberg did a series based on those on Raymond Palmer's magazines, and even the first logo I used on air, I really liked it because it harkened back. I changed it. I changed it, but I thought it really harkened back to those 1950s days of monsters and aliens, and how innocent everything was. So anyway, this is how Raymond Palmer became known to Fred Chrisman. Now, what Fred Chrisman or what Raymond Palmer didn't do was he didn't tell Kenneth Arnold when he wanted him to go check out this encounter. He didn't tell Kenneth Arnold that he knew Fred Chrisman. So it's a very, very interesting story. So the last thing that I would like to say about Fred Chrisman before we close this out, and just to give you as a kind of a teaser, In the movie JFK, they don't really have. There's a Guy Bannister, who's the same Guy Bannister who is the special agent in charge for Montana and Idaho in the Maury Island encounter. There's nobody in the movie for Fred Chrisman. However, according to Ken Thomas, he says that the person played by Kevin Bacon, the prisoner who's kind of gay, whatever, that was more than anybody. That was a more accurate description of Chrisman. Now, when you saw the movie, you would have noticed that there were a group of people. Remember, Chrisman is a pilot, and Chrisman becomes connected to David Ferry, who is the friend of Lee Harvey Oswald, right? So all of these things come into play after John F. Kennedy is murdered. Now, there are a couple things that we're going to talk about in episode 3, and I just want you to be aware of as far as the JFK, because, okay, so we're talking about UFOs here. And for a long time, a lot of people say that JFK was killed by the mafia. He was sleeping with Sam Giancana's girlfriend, or he was killed because of the Bay of Pigs invasion, et cetera, et cetera. Now, I can tell you two things before we go that I'm just going to pretty much leave it as far as the CIA, et cetera, Army, the chief of staff, the military-industrial complex killing him. According to people, Fletcher Prouty and people that were working at the Pentagon, the Vietnam War was already played out on paper in 1962, 1963. Whether John F. Kennedy was there or not, they already had the troop levels. They already had the casualty estimates. They already had the costs. It was already a foregone conclusion. So how they were going to do that with Kennedy in place, I have no answer to that. Now, there's another side of this. And this has to do, back again, with these people, a Chrisman, a Bannister, et cetera, that are involved and with a UFO, project. Now, according to documents, Kennedy wanted to trade our space secrets with the Soviet Union. So basically, I mean, if you look at it from whichever level of the onion you want to look at it from, if you're looking at it from the point of view of the generals, they're going to say, we're going to just give all of our rocket information. The only thing that keeps them from blowing us up, we're going to give all of our rocket information to the Soviet Union, and all of our space information and all the money that we invest, we're just going to cough it up and give it to these people for free. And so that would have had that would have been very, I guess, grating on those people. But there was another thing, and that is that Kennedy had back channels and knew about the Roswell crash where most people didn't. And this is definitely documented by a number of people, but Kennedy knew about the Roswell crash. And when he starts talking about sharing information, remember Majestic 12? Now, the last thing I'm going to say before we, end the podcast and we pick this up down at Maury Island. So the last thing that I want to say before I end the podcast is that according to the same people who found out that the troop estimates, et cetera, were already planned out, in the Pentagon before the Vietnam War was even fought. When JFK was killed, the day he was killed, bomber pilots flying their missions heard that there was, the president had been killed. So immediately they went to get their code books and moved to, code 1, code red, whatever it is. And there were no code books. Somebody had gone in to the bombers, the SAC nuclear deterrent bombers. We need you to head straight for the Soviet Union at a moment's notice. They had no code books. They had no way to get orders. They had no way to do anything. So who would have the power to do that? The only people who would have the power to do that is not the mafia, and it's not Boeing, and it's not the Cubans, and it's not Castro. The only people that can take code books out of a B-52 Stratofortress is a general in the Air Force that has a Majestic 12 clearance. So when we get into that area of why JFK was killed, and this is not JFK, show, and we're not going to get into JFK any more than it touches on our Mr. Fred Chrisman and our Mr. Bannister from the FBI. So those are the things that we're going to be looking at when we go down to Tacoma in our next podcast. And we will be hopefully doing that within the next few days. And so we hope you'll join us. It's going to be a really good time. And I certainly guarantee you it's going to be educational. So for Matthew Hines and Encounters USA, I just want to remind you guys that when you're out there this summer, especially if you're down by Maury Island, you better watch your back. Thanks for listening to tonight's show. Please remember, if you've had an encounter, we want to hear about it. Go ahead and email us at encountersusa1@gmail.com or contact us at encountersusa.com, our website, and go to the contact form. All right, everybody. Until next time, be careful out there. And if you're out in the woods, watch your back.